eviction letter, pink slip, foreclosure notice, or go on yet another bad date? Does it seem like the older you get, the more hopeless life seems? Are you ready to stop taking no as your final answer? Then join us for Design Your Life, a talk show by Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach. Go into the locker room for 1 full hour with the championship coach every week and start designing your winning playbook that will make the rest of your life the best of your life. That's Design Your Life with Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Central Time on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
We are pleased to bring you this special series on Unity Online Radio. To learn about other series, go to unityonlineradio.org and click on Special Series.
Welcome to a special series, The Three Faces of God, with co-hosts Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport, author of The Five Principles. They'll be exploring the different aspects of the divine that show up in world religions and in unity. No matter what you think about God now, stay tuned for new ideas on The Three Faces of God.
Welcome to the Three Faces of God. This is a new 6-week series designed to look at 3 different aspects of God. God within us, God in relationship to us, and God as all that is. It's deceptively simple sounding, isn't it? I'm Ellen Davenport. I'm here with Karen Kelly. Hi, Karen.
Hello, Ellen.
We're excited, and we're both delighted that you joined us. Okay, so first of all, people listening to these shows often ask whether we're in the same place. No, I'm in the hills outside of Austin, Texas. Karen's in the suburbs outside of Chicago. And through the magic of technology and Skype and our radio engineer in Kansas City, the multi-talented Jeff Comfort, we're coming to you live and being recorded for posterity. So you may be listening to this show years from now. In this new series, we'll be talking about an idea that comes from Ken Wilber, who is hard to describe. He's a mystic, a teacher, a prolific author in Colorado. But, Karen, let's take a step back. I remember one day, I think it was last year, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. You called me all excited about the 3 Faces of God. Yeah. So tell me again where and how you heard about it.
Well, I was taking a ministerial class at Unity Institute, and Reverend Robert Brummett was teaching this class, and it was called Introduction to Integral Spirituality. And I have to tell you, I really didn't know what I was getting into, but it sounded interesting. So it's based upon a book by the same title, written by that philosopher-writer Ken Wilber that you just mentioned. And as you might know, might be worth mentioning that Reverend Brummett is going to be a guest on our show in a few weeks, and that will be great show. So
yeah, he can just teach you all directly what he taught Karen.
Absolutely, and you'll get it right because he's given it to you. He'll correct all my mistakes. So anyway, in this class, we learned about Ken Wilber's observations that all the great world religious traditions understand God in 3 basic ways, and he called these ways the 3 faces of God. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Ellen, the 3 faces include that first face perspective, the God within us, that second face perspective of God, the divine other, the I, thou, the I'm God and you're not.
We'll talk about that.
I know. And that third face perspective of God, the great web of life, the ground of being, all that is. So Ken Wilber observed that no world religion incorporates all 3 faces of God in their spiritual practice. Every religion seems to choose one or maybe two, but never all three. Now,
and they're often judgmental about the ones that they're not using.
Isn't that the truth? So Wilber surmises that all three faces are vitally important, and when we exclude any one of them, we cut ourselves off from really rich spiritual experiences. Because he said, even though each face of God holds truth, it's still just a partial view of all that the divine is. So sort of like in our own lives, when we experience ourselves and others in the I, you, he, she, it versions, there's also truth in the same way in the realm of spirit. Each one of those three faces holds very important understandings and experiences for us.
So why do you think this struck such a chord with you? And then I'll tell you about me.
I know. Well, it struck a chord with me mostly because since I've come into Unity, I've really missed practicing the second face of God that I grew up with in the Lutheran Church. And, this is sort of the God that I can surrender to, I can worship, and I can adore. It's very satisfying to have that relationship. It's kind of like God is the loving parent who always listens to me, always accepts me, always forgives me. But when I came into Unity, I did get really excited to learn about the first face of God, the great I am, the God that I was a God in expression, because that was all news to me coming from a traditional faith. But, we in Unity tend a little bit towards rejecting or at least repressing the second face of God. And I get that. A lot of us coming into Unity have been beaten down and bruised by the misuse of the second face of God. The God that judges and condemns and punishes us because we're hopeless sinners that you are going to talk more about, I know.
Sinners. Yeah, you bet I am.
But, Wilber points out that there's a healthy, useful second face of God, too. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I know we're going to talk more extensively about the second face of God a little bit later. But that's what brought me and got me excited about it. I like the idea of the first face of God, but I frankly have sort of missed my I-thou relationship with the divine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my story is a lot the same, although I grew up Baptist. You were Lutheran, and found Unity well into adulthood and became a Unity minister in 1999. And so I've been one of the people trying to get people to shift their perspective of God from the old man who's out there watching you and keeping tabs on your behavior to the divine within and the universe, the God of all that is. Mm-hmm. And I think they and I have ended up confused because the first question they ask is, well, wait a minute, where am I aiming my prayers? Am I praying to myself? Am I just sending them out into this universe where there's not really anyone listening? Mm-hmm. And so I was delighted to find the three faces of God. It's one of those things that now that I've got it, it's blindingly obvious, but I really hadn't quite put it together that we were talking about God in three different ways. Mm-hmm. So I've been really grateful to have it. As we do this show, my personal focus is on, or will be on, whether it's possible to have a healthy relationship with God as other. Because, I've been preaching for years, don't look outside yourself for answers. You have the divine within. It's all within. Just go there. But you're right. And most people in my church are just like you. They miss, and in fact, they refuse to give up the idea of a higher power out there who knows more than they do and can guide their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said so much. And one point I wanted to make is you said once you're exposed to these three faces, it becomes blindingly obvious.
Yeah.
And I hear what you're saying, but it does bring me to what I'm most interested in this, in that it's blindingly obvious to me intellectually, but it's the experience of each of these faces of God that's a little evasive for me. Most importantly, I'm talking about the first phase of God, because even though I intellectually understand and believe that I made 100% of God stuff and that I am God in expression, and Unity's taught me a lot about this, and in metaphysics and the absolute and the relative and all that, just believing it to be true really isn't enough. I have a driving need to experience that truth and to feel it and to know, not in my brain, but to know in my whole being the truth of my oneness at the very deepest levels of who I am, and to experience what that feels like. And that's maybe a little bit easier said than done.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about that a lot as these shows go on. We have a number of guests lined up in the coming weeks, and we'll probably ask each one of them, how do you experience this? Okay, we've got it. 3 faces of God, and we'll talk more about those too in this show. But where do you aim your prayers is one way to phrase the question. How do you feel the divine within? How do you talk to God as other? And what do you do with God is all that is? I mean, that I guess well, anyway, we'll get to all of that. It's going to be an interesting week. So before we have to go to a break, Karen, let's talk a little more about where all this comes from. Ken Wilber, he's not a minister. He's not a religious person of any kind, right? So why is he the one teaching the rest of us about God?
Good point. Well, as we mentioned earlier, Ken Wilber's contribution is really that he recognized that there are 3 main approaches to understanding God. I mean, it was really a matter of research and understanding and looking, and he sort of went, there are 3 main approaches to understanding God in the world's religions, but no religion, organized religion anywhere, embraces all 3. And in fact, many religions adamantly reject at least one, if not 2 of these phases.
Yeah.
So, for example, Jesus and the other mystics throughout history who realized spirit in the first person, in the first phase, the God within, and then said so out loud, usually ended up crucified or hanged or stoned or burned at the stake.
Right.
So it was considered heresy to claim such things. And even though there's less crucifying today, it's still true in a lot of our traditional theistic religions. It's heresy to say I'm God. Right?
Yeah. And a lot of people who come into Unity are looking around to, expecting to be struck by lightning when we talk about the divine within. It took me a long time to get used to the idea of saying, I am God in expression. Not all that God is, but I am God in expression. Right. Anyway, Ken Wilber.
Well, Ken Wilber surmised that our spiritual life and our experience as humans suffer if we do not embrace all 3 faces of God in our spiritual practice. That is, once again, the God within, the God in relationship, and the God as all that is.
Right.
And without going into detail about his so-called integral philosophy, which is very complicated and also very comprehensive, Wilber says that there's actually a correlation between our levels of development, or we might call levels of consciousness, and our understanding of what God is. So all 3 of these faces are always present and available to us, but we tend to focus differently based on where we are developmentally or where our level of consciousness is. But we really do require and need and crave the truth that's found in every single one of these phases to experience a fully human and divine life. So based on where we're starting, at our levels of consciousness that we are, certain practices are going to be more effective than others to help us have the deepest experience. And we'll be talking a lot about that when we have Robert Brummett on the show, because he's going to talk a lot about the actual practices that we can use to enhance each one of these faces of God. That's going to be a great show. But enough about Uncle Ken for now. Let's get back to the really meaty stuff.
You and I both know a lot of people who are students of Ken Wilber's, and they're just really, really smart. I'm not one of them. I haven't tried to tackle that. He's basically trying to come up with a theory of everything, just to explain everything. But I get when he talks about the three faces. And if you want to hear Ken Wilber talk about this himself, YouTube has a lot of videos of him.
Absolutely.
And he named the three faces of God. This is based on our old English grammar lessons. He called them first person, second person, and third person. Remember that from English? My mother was an English teacher, so I remember it. First person is I, second person is you, and third person is it. So God as I means the divine within. God as you means a relationship, the I-thou relationship. And this is the one we may talk about most in this series. Well, I'll probably talk about it most. And then the third person is it. And in this context, it just means God is all that is. God is everything and more.
I love that last sentence that you said. God is everything and more. You know, in Unity, we embrace what's called panentheism. Panentheism. This is the idea that everything that is of God and in God and is God in expression. But the totality of everything that ever was, is now, or ever will be does not add up to be the totality of God. God's always greater than the sum of its parts and greater than its creation. It's a really important concept. And so for anybody out there who might not quite, I wasn't clear, I like to think of it kind of like the concept Plato had of chairness. So if you think of all the kinds of chairs you've ever sat in, you've ever seen, all the chairs that have ever been in all the history that there's been a chair are now or haven't even been created yet. There's lots of designs and colors and materials and interpretations. All of them have attributes that let us know they're chairs. But if you add them all up, they still won't equal the total of what the idea of a chair can be, because there's always endless possibilities. And that's how it is with God. God is endless possibility. That's kind of what panentheism means.
So pantheism is something a little different. We're saying panentheism.
Right.
I like the concept of chairness. Chairness. Yes. Who knew that was a theological concept? So wherever you are on your spiritual path, there will be something in this series worthwhile for you. When we come back from the break, we'll talk in more detail about the three faces of God, what they are, how they might show up in your life. And through the course of this series, we will focus a lot on how to experience the three faces. What do we do with this understanding of God once we have it? So remember, you can join the discussion on our Facebook page called Three Faces of God. Click the like button and post your comments or your questions. Let us know where you are with God these days. And even if you're listening years from now, I'll bet the Facebook page will still be there. So we'll be back after these messages from Unity.
As Unity Online Radio continues to expand its programming and outreach to the world, we count on the support of listeners like you. Please make your donation today. Go to www.unity.fm and click on Donate Now.
Hi, this is Ellen Davenport. The Five Principles was my first book, and here's what I've learned as an author. It's nice to sell a lot of books, but it's truly gratifying to know the book is being read, used, and studied in churches and small groups in the U.S. and beyond. And I get a real kick out of hearing that someone gave the Five Principles to friends who aren't in Unity. Because the Five Principles are universal spiritual laws. They operate in everyone's life, whether they know it or not. They've been discovered and rediscovered by spiritual masters for thousands of years. God is all there is. We are expressions of God. We create our experience with the power of our thoughts. We align ourselves with the well-being of the universe through prayer and meditation. And we live the truth we know every day in every decision. Just Five Principles. They cover it all. Buy the book at unity.org.
You're listening to The Three Faces of God, a special series with co-hosts Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport. Join the discussion on Facebook and submit questions for upcoming shows. Now, back to The Three Faces of God.
We are back. We are deep in conversation about the three faces of God. Actually, Karen, I think with that little riff on panentheism, we've gotten into the third face. We're already on the third face. So let's just start there and work backwards.
Okay.
The third face, or the third person, is God as it, or everything, or all that is. Paul Tillich called it the ground of being. The author of Acts said we live and move and have our being within this presence, this energy.
Yes. This third face is that great web of life. I love Ken Wilber's description. He calls it the great perfection of existence itself unfolding. I love that. It's the infinite face of God. So, that third face of God is pretty easy to understand because we all experience our world through our senses. We see the vastness of the universe in the beauty of the Grand Canyon, and we hear the songs of the little birds as well as the tornado's freight train roar. And, of course, we smell the fresh air or the fragrance of a rose, and we touch the softness of a caterpillar or a newborn baby skin, and we taste the sweetness of a freshly picked strawberry or the coolness of spring water. So from all these sensory experiences, they create an emotional response. From this, we experience awe and wonder, amazement, appreciation. And with things like earthquakes and floods and thunderstorms and, tigers, I suppose. We also, I'm
just waiting to see what you come up with.
I know I'm on a roll here. We also experience fear and respect and powerlessness, and perhaps even a sense of oneness. So all of this becomes our third face spiritual awareness when we experience it through our senses, our hearts, and our minds, and it's evidence of the divine in expression everywhere, that immanent God.
Yeah, okay. What this reminds me of is growing up in West Texas. My mother and brother and I used to go out in the backyard at night and lie on a blanket and look at the stars. And the stars at night, in fact, are big and bright in Texas. And in West Texas, we could see zillions of stars. And my mother would always say, it just makes you think what an insignificant speck you are. And I didn't like that at all.
Yeah,
So, you mentioned powerlessness and fear and awe. And I get that. Standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, you just have a moment when you know there has to be a God. This cannot be an accident. This kind of beauty and magnificence. On the other hand, what you described is all coming through our five senses, which I think of as pretty limiting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And actually, it makes really good sense. And Ken Wilber says that's the problem of just being accepting the third face of God as your only avenue to feel the divine and experience the divine. Because if you only are looking at what's in nature and your senses and the feelings of awe and wonder that come out of that, you don't get to a point of exploring the inner relationship with God and the I-thou relationship. So as beautiful and wonderful as the third face is, it's still only one part of three parts. And so you're right. It's all that wonderful stuff, and it has limitations.
Actually, though, it may be my favorite of the three. And, of course, the understanding that God is all that is the first of Unity's 5 principles. Unity teachings can be boiled down to 5 universal spiritual laws that have been discovered and rediscovered by spiritual teachers and the world's major religions for thousands of years. They certainly don't belong to unity. They're considered laws, though, because they're just how the world works.
And you wrote a terrific book about them.
I did write a book about them, the 5 principles. And this is the first principle, that God is everywhere present. God is all there is. When we teach it to our kids in Unity, we say there is no spot where God is not. That's the third face.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed.
Well, so let's just set that aside, skip to the first face, and then come back to the second, because that is likely to be a long discussion. So first face.
Okay. Well, isn't the understanding of a first face of God also one of our Unity principles?
Yes, actually. Principle number 2 says we are divine beings. We are God in expression. There's a lot of focus on this in Unity. And people will nod and they'll say, yes, the divine is within me. But I think a lot of us are asking now, okay, what does that mean? How do we live in divine consciousness? Mm-hmm. If Jesus said we could do anything he could do, and he's our model for this, then can we live as he did?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a big one for me, Ellen. This is my big one. This is the one that I have the most trouble with, because you're right. Jesus taught and modeled all 3 faces of God for us. And when Jesus said, I and the Father are one, in John chapter 10, verse 30, he was really expressing his reality as the first face of God. So that first face of God is the inner face of God, as you were saying, Ellen. It's the God and I are one face. But, for me, it's not enough to just believe that I'm God. I can talk about the theology. I can listen to talks on metaphysics to explain how I am God. But, frankly, it just doesn't get me there. I have to experience it. And I think this is easier said than done, because it takes practice. It takes disciplined practice. And, that key practice that helps us reach the realization of being one with God is, of course, meditation. And we're going to talk a lot about the spiritual practices like meditation that help us when we have Robert Brummett on our show in a few weeks. And he's an expert in this. He can really make things very clear for us where they're not. But he still has some work to do with me. So anyway, when we do reach the experience of the first face of God, we know deeply that there is no separation between God and us. And we are experiencing no sense of time or space or intellect or emotions, none of our 5 senses. We find ourselves in formlessness, our true self as entirely one with the whole. We can experience that we're God, and we can experience that we're love. It's, to actually have that experience has got to be so rich. And I've had little glimpses of it so that I know it's true, but it's still evasive to me to a certain degree.
It was a year or 2 ago, I did a talk on a Sunday morning about feeling like a fraud, that I think we all occasionally feel like a fraud. And as a minister especially, I often feel like, okay, this will be the Sunday when they realize I don't know what I'm talking about. And, I think everyone has some experience with that imposter syndrome. But at the end of the talk, I was trying to think, well, okay, what would be the opposite of feeling like a fraud? What is it we're trying to go for? And what popped out of my mouth was, if I were not a fraud, if I didn't feel like a fraud, I would just be unapologetically divine.
Yeah.
And I ended up doing a whole series after that called Unapologetic Divinity.
I remember.
And it was about how your divinity might show up at work, as a spouse, as a parent, as a friend. And it was a study in not only how do we experience it, but how do we live it? And I think what you said, we get glimpses of it. We get moments of it. Mm-hmm. And occasionally, I've heard from a lot of people, actually, that they've had periods of time when they felt this great sense of love and oneness.
Yes.
That they knew the great web of life. Maybe it was third face for them, but they also knew themselves as a part of God. Mm-hmm. And I'm envious of that. When I hear people talk about that. But so, I mean, does it have to be that dramatic, do you think, to experience the divine within?
Yes, I do.
Oh, well,
because it's one thing to intellectually discuss it, and it's another thing to say, well, how does it show up and what do I do and how do I act in my life? But the middle piece is experiencing the truth of it and the reality of it, and actually having the experience. It's kind of like, I don't know, maybe saying, I know I've heard people talk about love. I've seen it in the movies, and I know what I'll do with someone if I fall in love with them. But that's different than the minute I feel that deep sense of love for another human being. It's an experience. So I think, to me, that the idea of the experience results in, and the awareness of the truth of that experience then shows up in how I act out and how I live in my relationships and how I show up in the world, and how, it helps me model what my behavior is going to be, because I'm coming from that awareness and that truth of who I am. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And one of the things I ended up saying in this series about unapologetic divinity that was important for me, I don't know about the audience, but, ministers are always just talking to themselves, really, is that it's not about trying to be good. It's not about behaving well. And that may be just my personal reaction because I grew up in a church with so much emphasis on behavior. No drinking, no dancing. Some of those people didn't even think boys and girls should be in the same swimming pool. And it was behavior based. God is watching you, and the way you relate to God is by obedience. And so somehow expressing our divinity, what I'm trying to say is not about behavior. It's not about trying to be good. You see what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, I had an easier time of it in the Lutheran Church, girl. I mean, you were.
I thought Lutherans were classic worm of the dust teachers.
Oh, God, no. Well, there's a couple divisions of the Lutheran Church that think that way, but the Lutheran Church of America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, is not that way. It's actually very loving. God loves you so deeply. It's heavily on Jesus loves me. He loves you so much that he showed up in life to, in the human form to show you the way. So, plus we get to drink and dance our butts off.
Well, no wonder you miss that God.
Yeah, no kidding, huh?
Your God was a lot more fun than mine. Yeah. That's why you want a relationship with God.
Exactly. You got it. My God was a party animal, yes. Oh, dear. I think we're headed down a rat hole here.
Yeah, we may be. So here's what I'm thinking. We've talked so far about the third face and the first face. So God as everything and more, and then the divine within. And for me, one follows the other, and that is also principle 1 and principle 2 in Unity's 5 basic principles. So I feel less grandiose saying I am divine when I remember that God is all there is. So what else could human beings be? If trees and sunsets and puppies represent the divine, then so do we. But I'm still gnawing on how to live more consciously as a divine being. And maybe that brings us to the second face of God, the relationship.
I think it does. I think that's exactly where it brings us.
Well, okay. This is the one where I have problems, and I think a lot of people in Unity who come from traditional, conservative, or fundamental church backgrounds shy away from this second face of God, having a relationship with God, because the one we were taught to have was painful. So the second face of God, we'll go back over it. Second face of God is the intimate face of God. It's the face where we experience the relationship with God, the divine other. It's the I thou relationship that Martin Buber talked about.
Right. Well, Ken Wilber does say that he thinks it's pretty understandable why so many people abandon that myth of God, the judgmental guy in the sky that you're talking about, Ellen. In fact, Wilber points out that we really need to abandon that old image from those earlier levels of consciousness. But the key is that we get rid of that judgmental myth of God, but we should not abandon spirit in the second person. He says that when we repress the great thou, it often goes hand in hand with what he calls boomeritis. And boomers tend to emphasize the third and the first faces so that there's nothing left to which I must bow down to and surrender.
Well, okay. Wait. 80 million boomers, he's saying, refuse to surrender.
I think it's probably a generalization.
Seems like a sweeping generalization coming from Ken Wilber.
Yeah, but you know what? It also reflects kind of the level of consciousness that was coming out of our prior generation. It's also kind of generational here because our generation before was really about that controlling, behavior-driven kind of God. And
obedience.
Yeah, obedience. So when our generation came along, and our education and all the things that we've been exposed to, we go, there's something corny about this. There's something that doesn't work there for me. So rather than find a way through it and to accommodate it, we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they say, well, there's just two faces of God. There's the third and the first. Mm-hmm. So the second face becomes a problem because, in truth, Wilber says that the only real response to that unconditional, eternal, and accepting love that the divine offers us in the second face, the only real response possible is surrender and devotion. And, I have to tell you that it reminds me, the book you and I both like from Anne Lamott so much. I think it's called Wow.
Help, Thanks, Wow.
Help, Thanks, Wow.
The three essential prayers.
Yes. And it's interesting because help and thanks are really second person perspectives. Mm-hmm. They're second phase perspectives. And the wow is a third phase perspective. And it just occurred to me that she's kind of in a traditional faith, and she isn't talking at all about the first face of God.
Hey, you know what? I hear our theme music playing. It must be time for a break. Jeff is really subtle with this stuff. Okay, so we will be back with more Three Faces after these messages.
Okay.
If I were brave, I'd walk the razor's edge, where fools and dreamers dare to tread, and never lose faith.
How is life working for you? Would it be okay with you if life got easier, simpler, yet more meaningful and vibrant? Join certified life coach Carla McClellan Tuesday afternoons for Vibrant Living. Each week, Coach Carla and her guests will share strategies and solutions designed to make your life more vibrant. Is there something in your life you'd like help with? A dream you'd like to achieve? A relationship you'd like to improve? Call into the show toll-free for Coaching with Carla. That's Vibrant Living, Life Coaching with Carla. Tuesdays at 3 p.m. Central on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
What if we're all meant to do what we secretly dream?
You're tuned in to the Three Faces of God. Here are your hosts, Karen Kelly and Ellen Davenport.
Hey, we are back for our final segment of the Three Faces of God. Before we run out of time, I want to let you know there are a number of resources where you can learn more about the Three Faces of God. And you don't have to read Ken Wilber's books if you don't want to. They're deep. But this is an increasingly popular topic within Unity. So if you just Google Unity Three Faces, you will get a long list of things to read, videos to watch. You'll see, Karen, you wrote an article for Unity Magazine, and was it the March edition?
Mm-hmm.
Called The Three Faces of God. You'll also find a list of talks that various Unity ministers have done on this, including me. In fact, I'll just put a list of references on the Three Faces Facebook page, including the books that have been written by some of our upcoming guests.
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah, I want to give a little plug here because there's 3 books in particular that I really want to mention to our listening audience that I think are really useful, and reading them in advance of the shows might be worthwhile for them to get the most out of the show. The first one is Reverend Paul Smith's book that he called Integral Christianity, The Spirit's Call to Evolve. I like this a lot because it is a Christian perspective on Ken Wilber's whole integral theory, and it tells a lot about a Jesus that you may not ever have known, and how Jesus showed us, modeled for us how to live as God, and how he spoke to God, and how he spoke about God. And there's really good illustrations in that book about how Jesus taught us to live with all 3 faces. And it's just a terrific book, and it's so easy to read.
Well, Paul Smith is such a great guy. He's a Kansas City minister. You'd swear he's a Unity minister talking to him, but secretly he's a Baptist. But I'm really looking forward to our interview with him in next week's show.
Yep. And then our very own Unity minister, Reverend Robert Brummett, has 3 books, and he's the guy who taught the class that turned me on to all this. But he's got actually quite a few books, but the ones that I'm going to speak of specifically to the 3 faces, one is called Birthing a Greater Reality, A Guide for Conscious Evolution, and it is spectacular. And he came out with a brand new book I think it's just last week, isn't it, Ellen?
It's this month for sure.
Yeah, called Living Originally. And that's going to be really important because it's all about the spiritual practices that we can use to help us reach these experiences that we've been talking about of the 3 faces of God. And we've mentioned before, both Paul Smith and Robert Brummett are going to be exclusive guests on our show. So it's going to be very, very exciting.
Yeah. So look on our Facebook page, Three Faces page. We would love to just talk to you there anyway, but we will put resources there and others as we find them. In fact, Karen, when you said something in the previous segment about leaving behind the mythic God, M-Y-T-H-I-C, mythic. There's another wonderful book called The Death of the Mythic God by Jim Marion, who also wrote Putting on the Mind of Christ. So obviously he's about the divine within. And so you said, okay, go ahead and leave behind the mythic God, the unhealthy relationship with a punishing, watchful God, but don't abandon spirit. So how do we not abandon spirit in the second person?
Yeah. Well, it's really about getting our ego out of the way. When I know. Oh, God, the pain of it. So the first thing is that we need to set aside our ego. The second face of God really is a problem if our ego thinks we're accepting that we're lowly sinners, worms in the dust, that we're unworthy, and all those things that you were talking about, Ellen. Our ego rejects that,
Well, and I think, but our ego also gets really excited when it thinks, oh, I'm God.
As a matter of fact, Robert Brummett says that the first face of God is the great ego inflator, and the second face of God is the great ego deflator. And I think he's saying it just a little bit tongue in cheek, but that is the way it often shows up. So anyway, it's not about that at all. Wilber tells us that it's really about acknowledging that there's something greater than me, something beyond myself. And I believe that we are aware of this in somewhere in our being. This isn't a new concept for us. And it's probably a good explanation was given by Unity minister Eric Butterworth, and that book was Discover the Power Within, right?
I think so.
I think so. Where he explains that we are like drops of the ocean. Every drop of the ocean contains all that which the ocean contains. Every drop contains all the same attributes of the whole ocean. But that drop is not the whole ocean. So we merge into and we surrender to that ocean in the second phase. And we're surrendering into what I call my true self, but even more than my true self. And it's very gratifying, I think, that it's a comfort. It's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of connection. It's a sense of expanding beyond all that I am into the greater of everything. And like you said earlier, Ellen, the second face is called the intimate face of God. So it's also the possibility here of unconditional love. This God, this intimate God of the relationship is the God that always loves me. This is the God that always accepts me, forgives me, supports, encourages, and comforts me. It's kind of like God saying, come to me and I will give you rest. And it's also written, I am with you always. So this is the Abba, the Papa, the relationship God that Jesus prayed to and taught us to pray to. Mm-hmm. So, in that context, the things that we're talking about here, the idea that we're having a relationship with all that I am, but beyond that, all that is, of which I am a vital and integral part and one with, and the idea that it's a relationship of unconditional love. Well, you know what? I can love that God back. I can ask this God for help and direction. I can thank this God for all I receive, and I can depend on this God always because this God will never fail. So it's a very comforting idea, and it's a comforting concept, and it's a comforting experience. I don't find it to be a humbling experience at all. It's not a downgrading. It's a joyous reuniting, so to speak, and an awareness of the relationship with this truth that loves me dearly, that is love and expression. So, how do we actually communicate with God in this I thou relationship? It's usually through prayer, right? So I pray. I can do contemplative prayer. I can pray whatever meditative prayer I can pray. Help me. I can pray, but prayer is the vehicle for relationship, and we can express our connection with this face of God. Also, we see it sometimes through song and through music, through art. But bottom line is, if we throw out that misuse, that misunderstanding of the second face of God that was really used in earlier days to control, and it was designed to control, and we can feel loved and accepted. And I love the idea that we can feel safe. We are safe with this relationship.
So here's my problem with it. Mm-hmm. And I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just chewing on it. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid that this God that I can rely on and pray to and ask for help is something that encourages us to abandon our responsibility as divine co-creators. One of the things I've been preaching for years is, as a divine being, you have power and responsibility you have not imagined and have not claimed. And it's just so easy to throw up our hands and say, I can't handle this, God. You'll just have to do it. At the same time, I will own publicly that I'm afraid I've been wrong. I'm afraid that I have been robbing people of a way they could have experienced God by insisting that they focus on the divine within or focus on God as all there is. So as we go through this series, as the seconds count down, as we go through this series, that's what I'm going to be asking our guests is, how do we work that out?
Well, I want to give you, can I just,
can you do it in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I can. Okay. That second face is the vehicle to help us express the truth of who we are. That's the way that we can make that responsibility and all those co-creation things. It's the helper. It's our friend that helps us get where we've decided to be. It's our partner in the co-creation. It's the, one that we can talk to and say, hey, how am I doing? Or I'm feeling really crappy about this, or, whatever it happens to be. It's our friend in the journey. It's our helper to express it. So, and honestly, I
Karen,
think, go ahead.
Jeff's going to turn the screen red and, do what he does when we don't end the show on time.
I know, but it's not red yet.
And I suppose we should make sure to say, we're not looking for a correct understanding of God. We're looking for tools to help us understand and appreciate the depth of all the possibilities for being aware of the divine. So thank you for listening to the Three Faces of God. Obviously, we have more to talk about. Be sure to join us next week when our guest will be Paul Smith, who wrote the wonderful book, Integral Christianity. If you only read one book about the three faces, that's the one. Don't you think, Karen?
Yeah, it's a great one.
And join us on Facebook at Three Faces of God. We would love to hear from you. So until next week, may you know and see the face of God within you, in relationship to you, and in everything you experience.
Blessings.
Thanks for listening to The Three Faces of God with Karen Kelly and Reverend Ellen Davenport. This is a 6-week special series about understanding the divine in different ways. This program is brought to you in part by EllenDavenport.com and by Unity of Wimberley, Texas, online at unityofwimberley.com.
Do you think you know all you want to know about the characters in the Bible? Do you know who could be called the king who loved too much? Or what it means to be a Jezebel? Or that the best love story in the Bible begins with the declared commitment of 2 women? The Bible's symbolic meaning can help you transform your life and discover the presence and power of God within you. Find out what these characters can teach you about your own life today by tuning into Biblical Power for Your Life. Each week, co-hosts Reverends Karen Tudor and E.J. Niles present a Bible character from a historical, cultural, psychological, and symbolic perspective. Your comments and questions are part of this lively discussion. Tune in every Thursday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and power up your life only at Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
Inspiration only takes a moment. Take a moment now to reflect on these words from Reverend Joan Gattuso. According to an ancient Hindu teaching, if you can only speak the truth and tell no lies, either minuscule or outrageous, for 12 consecutive years, you can attain enlightenment. A noble being will always tell the truth. Do you? Begin now with the first step of simply noticing if you do tell the truth immediately, or if your first instinct is to alter the facts a bit. Resolve to be honest with yourself and others starting today. And after 4,383 days, you just may become enlightened.
This meditative moment is brought to you by Unity.
Ever notice how the funniest things happen when we stop taking ourselves too seriously and step out boldly? Listen to Funniest Thing with Daryl and Ed as these unlikely saints administer a refreshing dose of laughter and love that will inspire you to step out boldly and experience the funniest things. Join the discussion with Daryl and Ed live every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central Time on Funniest Thing, only on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.
Inspiration only takes a moment. Take a moment now to reflect on this message from Daily Word. Is something in your life causing you concern? Don't be discouraged. The presence of God is peace and harmony, healing and creative ideas, is with you every moment of every day, providing the help you need. In quiet moments of prayer, let go of any concern. Anchor your trust deep in the realization that with God all things are possible. Never doubt it for a single moment. You are a spiritual being, blessed with all that you need for happiness and fulfillment. God's wisdom will guide you. God's strength will help you do all that you need to do. And God's joy will lighten your heart with hope and courage.
This meditative moment is brought to you by Unity.
At the base of all life is the infinite wellspring of Source, and each of us has a unique way of expressing that Source as an individualized soul. Do you enjoy the company of inspiring people who are living on purpose? Do you want to live joyfully attuned to your own unique soul expression? Host Reverend Kristen Powell welcomes you to join the gathering of souls who live this way. You'll meet artists, naturalists, and other soulful expressions that will inspire you to call forth the most alive, passionate version of yourself. Get into the natural stream of your own soul by tuning into SoulStream live every Wednesday at noon Central Time on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world. Are you tired of life slamming the door in your face? Did you get another rejection letter, pink slip, foreclosure notice, or go on yet another bad date? Does it seem like the older you get, the more hopeless life seems? Are you ready to stop taking no as your final answer? Then join us for Design Your Life, a talk show by Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach. Go into the locker room for 1 full hour with a championship coach every week and start designing your winning playbook that will make the rest of your life the best of your life. That's Design Your Life with Kevin Cottrell Ross, the coach's coach, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Central Time on Unity Online Radio, the voice of an awakening world.